Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. at the conclusion of a national security space panel discussion on the FY19 budget. And joining us is Mike Tierney, who is a consultant with or works with Jacques Associates, but you're also the founder of spacebudget.com, which is going to get rolled out. So you're somebody who's more than a little bit of a passing familiarity with the space budget. And you gave a great talk assessing what space budget trends have been. Earlier in the morning, we heard from the chairman and the ranking member of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee, Mike Rogers of Alabama, the Republican from Alabama, but also Jim Cooper, the Democrat from Tennessee. We also heard from Congressman Lamborn and Dutch Ruppersberger, Republican from Colorado and Democrat from Maryland. And they were talking about, not enough of a priority on space spending. That's one of the reasons why the committee has been advocating for a Space Corps to try to change a little bit of that dynamic. But you're looking at the budget numbers over time. Talk to us about sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of the administration's space budget request and what it means for at least the immediate future as you can see it.
Sure, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity. The good is that there is definitively signals inside the budget that the Department and Air Force are listening both to Congress and the directives and mandates and initiatives that they want the department to implement on the national security space side, but also industry and the market and where commercial capabilities are headed. And we are able to see that in a couple places in the budget in this fiscal year 19 request in a way that we didn't see it in the 18 requests. There's more money being spent on the space control mission by a substantial margin, as well as space situational awareness. And in the unclassified portion of the space budget that we can see, those are really the signals that are responsive to the increasing threat environment in space. And so whether it's those specific investments or the strategies involved on some of the larger platforms like SBIRS and AEHF, I think the 19 budget is starting to demonstrate a earnest recognition of where the Congress's perspective is on this and shifting of investments into those priorities. It also is being responsive to the commercial market. So you have all these small launch providers coming out and small satellite constellations coming out. The department has been looking at that market, evaluating on how to integrate those capabilities into their architecture. And in the 19 request, we for the first time, have a new procurement line for the Air Force to go out and specifically buy small launch capability. So that would be one of the two really positives. And an overall 20% increase from what they thought they were going to be asking for this time last year for the 19 budget. So overall, a good bump in the space portfolio.
But you also noted that there were some misleading aspects in the budget, right? For example, operational responsive space ORS went up 357%, if I remember off the top of my head. But you said that was actually a misleading number. Congress has been pushing, for example, the Air Force to take greater strides in smaller, more responsive space architecture, whereas the Air Force has been resisting some of those moves. We saw that at the Reagan Forum in terms of the tension between the Air Force's number 2, but also General Hyten, who's the head of Strategic Command. Talk to us a little bit about some of the misleading aspects that are in this budget that, that the picture may not be as rosy as it might seem at first blush.
Sure, and I'm not sure it's intentionally misleading so much as just, the initial read is not as always clear as a detailed reading would provide. So when the budget first came out a couple weeks ago, the operationally responsive space line, which will evolve by congressional mandate to be called the DoD Space Rapid Capabilities Office, like you said, had a 300% increase. This is a program element that was chugging along around 9-10 million. It was on death's doorstep. Air Force tried to walk away from it. Congress resurrected it, several fiscal years ago, and it's been cooking along around 10 million for several fiscal years. Last year, the request was important in the sense that it bumped it up to 90 million, and that was to execute a specific weather mission that they operated out of ORS. So when the budget comes out today, a few weeks ago, in light of this mandate from Congress to rename it as the DoD Space Rapid Capabilities Office, you heard from Chairman Rogers this morning. His first point was that the DoD needs to move faster. So when you see a 350% increase, it looks like that's going to be exactly what the department and market are looking for. Upon further reading, that's a 1-year spike, really a 2-year spike, but after that, the budget for that program crashes back down to single-digit millions. And I don't think that is ultimately what Congress wants that program element to fund. That program element should be funding repeated, rapid acquisitions at probably the level that is in the 18 request. There's political capital and political will that needs to exert on that, but I think the department, the Congress is going to want to see the department present in future budget submissions a more integrated long-term approach for that office and that program.
There are concerns whether or not there are concerns about how long the funding stream is, the upside funding stream is going to be for the department. Adam Smith, I've asked this of other folks, you know, the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, sees it as being a 2-year window. We just talked to Jamie Moran, former Air Force Comptroller, former director of CAPE at the Pentagon during the Obama administration, now with the Aerospace Corporation. He said, look, I mean, we're already a lot of the way into 18, so it may be 18 months more money. We don't know what else is in, you know, what's going to happen after this current budget deal. Talk to us a little bit about that. Are these priorities the right priorities for the Department of Defense and the Department of the Air Force to be focused on if there's going to be a relative decline in the level of spending or a flattening of spending just in a couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would push back on is that Congress has shown absolutely zero willingness to stick with the Budget Control Act. So after we implemented sequestration in 2013 because Congress passed an appropriations bill that exceeded the statutory maximum, we've not triggered sequestration since because Congress has repeatedly, every couple years, revised the top-line allocations for the BCA. So I don't see any reason why in 2 years when they need another budget deal, the political will be found to find that short-term deal. Taking a step back, though, and remembering why we are even in this Budget Control Act sequester world, is that this was all intended to be a forcing function to get Congress to stop spending money. And what my analysis showed today is that despite the fact that the Department of Defense took a huge dip in spending to account for the Budget Control Act, overall government spending, because of the requirements from mandatory spending, has continued on the same trajectory as it was prior to any of this BCA and sequester. I think Congress knows that. I think they know that the tool that they're using, sequester and the Budget Control Act, has no meaningful impact on what the policy objective is, which is reduced deficits and reduced debt spending. They know that, and so they've been kicking the can every 2 years. So on the macro sense, I don't see why we should feel that 2 years down the road we won't have a similar kind of progressive increase in the Budget Control Act caps, or frankly an elimination of them because of how ineffective they've been from a policy perspective.
And so you're not a debt bear from that standpoint then? You're not as concerned that in 2 years' time, for example, that debt suddenly is going to become a primary issue that's going to drive a contraction in government spending?
Well, let me tell you this. If we think back to what caused the Budget Control Act in the first place, this is right after the midterm election of 2010. Tea Party Republicans came in a massive wave, and essentially this was all tied to the 2011 debt ceiling raise. The Republican caucus, which was now newly in control of both chambers of Congress, I think that's right, held President Obama's feet to the fire, and this became a grand negotiation, a grand bargain. And so I think it's important to recognize that the Budget Control Act construct that has persisted for the last 6 or 7 years was due to a very short, focused political moment that has had tremendous unintended consequences as Congress has continued to kick the can and not show the will to stick by the deal that they made in creating the Budget Control Act. So I'm not, I think it would be tied to another debt ceiling raise, but I'm not sure the political environment is as similar as it was in 2011 for there to be, an ability for any interest group to hold the, process hostage for the debt ceiling. And that's what precipitated all of this. So, I'm hopeful that, especially after the next election and, things in flux in terms of the political atmosphere, maybe there'll be a political will to just walk away from it and say that this was a bad policy solution to a very real problem. But until we get mandatory spending, until we get Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid under control, why are we punishing the department for no real outcome that meets the policy objective?
Speaking about punishment, it looks like Chairman Rogers was very clear about his desire for a Space Corps. That was echoed. There was absolutely no air between the view of the ranking member as well as his chairman. Jim Cooper was right there with Mike Rogers in saying, hey, the Air Force has been obstinate. It's been not handling the space portfolio and the enterprise properly. They raised some specific things, whether it was, hey, we in Congress told you to be promoting X number of people. You guys can't even do that. Talk to us a little bit about the challenges and potential consequences of creating a Space Corps. The chairman, drew laughs appropriately so, that he said, look, everybody's looking at the uniform as being the big problem. Hey, guess what? Make an Air Force uniform, make it black, problem solved. Get a nice little insignia and move on. That's not the point of this. Talk to us, though, a little bit about the costs associated with this, because would be the standing up of a new service in a way. They want to say it's not going to be the Department or Space Department, but it is going to be a part of the Air Force, and it's going to have its own regs and everything else that are going to have to go with it eventually over time. Is this going to be a large investment, a little investment? Is this going to be something that disrupts actually from the goal? Everybody, I think, is well-intentioned, but is this something that could actually become an expensive distraction as opposed to something that focuses the mind, at least in the near to midterm?
So what I would say to that is that I think that's an unanswered question, and even Congress recognizes that they don't have the answer to that currently. I think they have intuition and presumptions about whether those costs are manageable. But one of the legislative mechanics that they put in the fiscal year 18 NDAA, which just passed at the end of last year, beginning of this year, when they created all of these space organization and reform efforts, was to basically task an FFRDC, not affiliated closely with the Air Force, to answer that exact question. What are the mechanics? How would you actually implement creation of a Space Corps? I would think that would, undeniably raise the cost issues, some of the unintended consequences, logistical hurdles, and I think Congress will use that to be the kind of primary source for information on what the impact would be. That's going to be a lengthy process. It's going to be something that probably is not completed as quickly as Congress would want it to be, so that they can continue to legislatively move towards the Space Corps, because I can't imagine that report, which has not even, I think, begun, would be completed in time for this legislative cycle. So ultimately, I think what you'll see in this legislative cycle is the House Armed Services Committee is not going to walk away from this. There's going to be something in the bill that continues as they deem appropriate to push this towards the Space Corps. You heard from Chairman Rogers and Cooper that they kind of laid it at the feet of their Senate colleagues that said the Senate really wasn't ready during conference negotiations to go as far as they did, and they were hopeful that they could convince them otherwise this cycle. I think it'll be certainly more than a couple years before we have any more really meaningful, earnest progress towards an actual Space Corps. And a lot of that's because they don't have the answers to the questions that you're asking. How much is it going to cost? What are the impacts? How would we go about doing this? That FFRDC study and report is really the tool that Congress has created to give them the answers to overcome those objections.
Although if you listen to Chairman Rogers, right, the Senate's going to come along with them probably sooner, so it's going to be interesting whether or not they pull the trigger on that before they have actually the full facts. Mike Tierney, an independent consultant who works with Jacques and Associates and is the founder of spacebudget.com. And tell us, when's the website going to be out?
Should be up in the next week or so.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward to using that as a resource. Thanks very much for joining us, and look forward to staying in touch.
Thanks, Vago.